Okay, here
No,
it
there's a
goes.
button which says start webinar. It's now,
Okay.
it's live now.
Okay, fantastic. We're live now. We've got all the technology figured out. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We are so excited to bring you this first in a 3 series for our business series. We are going to have sessions today in October and December. Again, we're so glad to have you. My name is Jane McBride. I'm a class of 91 graduate, and I'm currently the Assistant Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement, coming to you with Cherrydale in the background. Again, we're glad to have you. A couple things about today. We're going to keep it to an hour. We are going to allow time at the end for question and answer. You can, at the bottom of your screen, submit any questions that you might have today for our presenters. We will do our best to get to the majority of those, but I don't think we'll be able to answer all of those questions depending on how many come in today. But again, so glad to have you. So excited for our next hour together with some great information about the economic impact of COVID-19. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Ken Peterson so that he can share kind of an update of what's going on around the university.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate it. I'll make this brief because the top card attendees here are the other 2 guys on the screen right now, not me. So I'll keep it short. I know that all of you and the organizations that you're with have experienced extraordinary challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic, and Furman is no exception to that. If you think about a residential college, we're really running a small city. We have people who live on campus, they eat on campus, they work on campus. And so we've had to adjust literally every process on campus to make sure that we could keep everybody healthy and safe while we lived out the Furman advantage. I am very pleased to report, very proud to report how extraordinary our faculty, staff, and students have been in this process. With literally a week's notice in the spring, our faculty had to convert classes to an online format. Our students who didn't go to college to take online classes had to convert their learning styles to online classes. And they did so with grace and flexibility in the spring, and we got through it. Then we had more time to think about how we would prepare for the fall term. So our ITS folks were ahead of the game, and they used some of our COVID relief money to purchase lots and lots of technology that we could put into literally every classroom on campus, so that we would be able to offer our courses in what we call the Furman Flex format. So a faculty member typically now will have students who are in the classroom, but they will also have some students who are remote if they're teaching an in-person class. And they will be engaging both of those groups of students, and they will be getting those students to interact with one another. So the nature of teaching and learning has changed dramatically. As you've probably seen in the newspapers, you can do everything to plan for a healthy, safe college campus, but at the end of the day, it's going to boil down to the choices that 18 to 22-year-olds make. And we have been incredibly proud of our Furman students. They want to remain on the Furman campus, and they are willing to do the things that you have to do to be a college student today in order to remain on campus. So they are masking, they are distancing, they're doing all of the things that will keep our community healthy and safe. And they're starting to become more creative about how to recreate and do the other things that college students need to do. The things that you remember fondly about college are a lot harder to pull off now in a safe manner, but they're starting to figure that out. So we're exceptionally proud of the Furman community. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how we've adapted. So when we had to pull in-person classes in the spring, very quickly, our internship office began to reach out to employers in our network to see which ones of them would be able to convert their internships that they had scheduled with our students to a virtual format. And I'm pleased to say a number of those were able to be converted. Our undergraduate research program, which is nationally known, is one of our signature programs as well, and a key part of the Furman Advantage. We were really excited to see our faculty adapt the research projects that they had planned for the summer to a virtual format. And we actually broke an all-time record in terms of the number of participants this summer in our undergraduate research program in spite of the COVID pandemic. So these are just examples of how the Paladins have risen to the occasion in these extraordinary times. I'll tell you that senior leadership is keenly focused on the long-term strategy of the university. So we are absolutely determined to make sure that the Furman Advantage continues to evolve in the way that it needs to evolve to produce an undergraduate college experience that's second to none. In the course of that, we are also elevating the activities around our institutes. So many of you will recall that we have the Riley Institute for Public Policy and Education. We have the Shy Institute for Sustainable Communities. We have the Institute for the Advancement of Community Health, and we have the newest Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And these four institutes interact with our academic departments and other units on campus and in the community in order to provide our students with exceptional experiences and to serve as a bridge into real world experiences for faculty, staff, and students. And they really help us tap into the intellectual and social capital of the members of the Furman community in order to help solve big and real world problems. So you're going to see, I think, more activity coming out of the centers and the institutes over the next 12 months. And we think that's just going to make a Furman education even richer than it is already. So I don't want to take any more of your time. Happy to answer questions later, but I'll turn it over to our speakers now. So fire away, guys.
I guess that's me. Thanks so much, Dr. Peterson. Hello, everybody. I want to first thank Jane McBride for putting this together, and all of you for taking your time off during lunch hour to attend yet another Zoom meeting, right, during this time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kailash Khandke. I'm a professor in the economics department. I've been at Furman for since 1995, so if you're doing the math, I've just completed my 25 years. And I just want to ask Dr. Peterson, I think, a basic question, and that is, why haven't I got my 25th year pin? I've invested the time at this institution, and I didn't get my little pin.
That's in the mail. I'm sure that's in the mail. So.
It's in the mail, he says. But look, it's been a great innings, as we say, at Furman for 25 years, and I'm looking forward to the next couple of years if we get over this pandemic anytime soon. Many of you in the audience, we can't see you in this webinar format, have maybe taken a class with me and so know me. Many of you don't. Many of you might be econ or business majors, but I suspect many of you are not. And so I'm going to make my presentation a little bit low key by doing what economists typically do, share some data with you, and then I'll walk you through a couple of things and make some comments at the end. So let me take this chance to share my screen with you and just do a simple PowerPoint with you and talk to you a little bit. All right, so I'm going to assume that all of you can see this, and I'll walk you through a couple of things. So as I put up this, oops. I don't know why it's not working, glitches with. Here we go. So as I put up this next slide and you're reading through what I've got on the screen, I'll just tell you how I want to sort of divide my comments over the next 15 minutes or so. I want to first share with you, I think, some data, some current data on unemployment and GDP so that you have a feel for, I think, kind of from my perspective, the dire situation we're in economically. Next, I'll talk to you a little bit about sort of, what economists typically do, right? We use we use an episode like this to look at past pandemics to see if we can get some insights. So I'll share with you some references that I found that have looked at past pandemics. And then I think I'm going to make the case or ask the question, I think, to you as in general, as far as the audience is concerned, if we think the current COVID-19 supply side shock, as I call it, is as bad as the Great Recession, or perhaps even worse than the Great Depression. And then I'll save some comments for the end in terms of things we've done and what, from a policy standpoint, things that might remain to be done. So let's take a look at this picture up here that I've got, right? And I think that it's pretty stark. You know, a year ago, unemployment was 3.7%. We reached an all-time high of 14.7% right after the pandemic. And of course, it's come down to 8.4%. Now, here's something that you might remember for those of you who've taken an Introduction to Economics course, right? We often say that economists and agents in our economy are optimizers, and we say that you know, consumers maximize utility, firms maximize profits, and I often say, if you've taken a class with me, politicians maximize votes. So this is not a partisan comment, but the fact that the unemployment rate has gone down to 8.4%, whether we had a Republican in the White House or not, they would exploit the situation and say, look, the economy is improving. But one of the things I want to sort of focus on as we think a little bit about this 8.4% unemployment, it masks a lot of what might be going on in what I would call the real economy. And here's an example, right? My wife and I haven't ventured out to a restaurant, outdoors or not, but we have done some takeout. And out of courtesy and out of curiosity, every time that somebody comes along, you know, and comes with mask, you know, equipped with a mask and drops off our food at our car window, I say, how's it going? And, you know, you must be glad to have some employment, right? And the answer inevitably goes something like this. Yeah, it's good to be working, but I'm working 1/4 the hours that I did before. And so I think what's masked behind this unemployment rate amongst those that are employed is that there's a real fall, a precipitous fall in what I would call real wages. And I'm going to make the case that that might have consequences as we approach 2021, because people are certainly employed, but they're making far less wages than they did before the pandemic struck. And that's really not picked up in the data as well. This is a picture of the unemployment benefits. You might see right on the far end of the first panel where I have my graph, how those unemployment insurance claims rose in 2020. They've fallen some. But if you look at the left side of the panel, it's saying that, look, you know, at the beginning of the year, unemployment insurance claims were about maybe 1.8 million, went up to 22 million, but they're still around the 13 million mark, right? So as of August 8/22, about a month ago, we still had 13 million claims. With the uncertainty remaining in the economy, you know, if we have a second wave, as some people are suggesting, when flu season comes around in November, is it going to be 22, going to get back there, or somewhere in between? I still think that the unemployment benefit story is a little uncertain, and I think we're going to see some increases over time. One of the things I'm interested in doing is looking at, you know, what this current crisis compares to others. So this is a slide that shows you, you know, where we were in 2020 at 14.7%. We're far higher. We were far higher than what we were during the Great Recession or the recession in 1982. Not quite high as the Great Depression, but certainly I think gives you a perspective in terms of, you know, what the unemployment effect was compared to over time going back all the way to the Great Depression. Here's something that we want to look at in terms of what's happened with growth. Many of you have no doubt heard that at an annualized rate, unemployment fell by -32%. The left side of the panel, you can see that bar that goes -31.7%. And the panel on the left tells you all the negative quarters of real GDP growth between 1947 and 2020. I like this picture from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Note that it hasn't updated, this particular article doesn't update for the -32% that you're seeing on the left panel. So I'd like for you to imagine taking that sort of, you know, beigeish bar, which is on the left-hand side, and superimpose it on the right-hand side, right next to the red bar. And of course, that would mean that we'd go right off our screen, right? But that tells you kind of what happens or what's happening with GDP right now. here's something that I thought was pretty fascinating, right? One of the things, my colleague Ken Peterson will agree with this, economists are good at exploiting data, finding things to do from a research standpoint. And you'll notice that both these particular research pieces from the NBE are current pieces, 2020. So as soon as the pandemic hit, these two individuals, Correa, Luck, and Werner, and Barrow, who's a pretty prominent economist, and Wang have done some estimates from the last pandemic. The last pandemic was the Spanish flu, the 1918 influenza. And what did they find? They find that lockdown type measures had relatively, for states that introduced lockdown type measures, they had relatively higher medium-term growth. They estimated that there were 50 million deaths worldwide, but the economists, the economic costs were large. Barrow and Company sort of estimate that the negative impact of GDP in 1918 was about 6 to 8%. Note, of course, that we didn't have our national income accounting all set in the early part of the 18th century. So this is an estimate of how much GDP would have fallen from at that time. Here's another one which I thought was pretty interesting, and this is a study by Arnold, Groniger, etc. It says a potential influenza pandemic, possible macroeconomic effects. This was a report to the Congressional Budget Office in 2006. And here's kind of what they sort of forecast at that time. They said, if we have a pandemic, it's going to, workers' limited social interactions would reduce both labor supply and consumption. It would lead to a reduction of the labor force and raise the ratio of capital to labor, lower the return to capital, reduce the pace of our infrastructure accumulation, and reduce GDP growth overall, right? They too estimated that the effect of this would be to reduce GDP in the short term by 2 to 4%. Now, I want you to sort of think a little bit about the argument that these authors are making in terms of what's happening on the capital labor side. And I think something that they didn't consider is something that I'm observing in the economy. And that is that as firms and corporations in particular adjust to the new abnormal and the new pandemic, one of the things they're realizing is that there might be some productivity gains, believe it or not, from working from home, right? And so what's that going to mean to the accumulated capital that we have in all of our major cities all over the place, right? As people decide we're not going to use that capital, we're not going to go into the office, we might sort of, find ways, especially in the service industry, to work from home. If that's the case, then I think that what we're going to see is a massive depreciation of capital. There's going to be a waste of capital, and a whole sector in the economy, not just landlords, but other sort of sectors of the economy, on the commercial side, are going to suffer from the fact that this capital is massively underutilized over the next 1 or 2 years, if in fact we go that route. If we compare this to the Great Depression, and that was one of my objectives in terms of thinking about this, at its peak, 1 out of every 4 Americans who wanted a job could not find one during the Great Depression, okay? I said to you earlier that our unemployment jumped to 14.7%. It's now at about 8.4%. But if we think a little bit about the fact, number that I didn't show you, that 1/5 of the labor force is currently looking for jobs, that's a number that I find eerily similar to the Great Depression. I'm just looking at my time to see how much time we have. All right. Again, sticking with that sort of theme of looking at the Great Depression, here's a little an Excel spreadsheet that I generated, right? And what you're seeing up here in the minus 9.27 number, that's the average of the real GDP negative growth in the years 30, 31, and 32. So that's saying minus 9.27. If you look at the entire 8 years from 1930 to 38, the economy in the United States grew at a modest 0.6%. The number 1.3, minus 1.3 is during the Great Recession. And here's what we're confronted with our current 2020 data, right? So this is quarterly data that you're seeing out here at the bottom of the screen. 2.4 minus 9.1 was the quarterly negative rate. Forecast from the private sector think it might be minus 14%, and in 2020, minus 3%. All that leaves us with entering 2021 at somewhere near minus 5, minus 6%. Now, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, doesn't have such a dire picture. It doesn't think the number is going to be minus 14. In an optimistic scenario in Q3, they think it's going to be 2%, but they think it might be as much as minus 8%. But all the same, it leaves us with this. I think we can expect that in 2021, we'll have very modest growth, but likely negative growth, at least in my opinion, and in kind of what I'm seeing in the statistics. So here are things that you're no doubt familiar with. This is what we've done so far, right? The new recovery laws, CPRSA. At the bottom of the screen, you've got PPP. That's been the big thing. All of this amounted to about $2 trillion, right? This was $2 trillion that Congress acted, in my opinion, a little bit late, but in that first month to get out. And $484 billion was the Paycheck Protection Program, aimed mostly at the restaurant and service industry, and likely saved at least about 2.5 million jobs. So that's, I think, sort of, a positive response that we saw coming out of this pandemic. I'll fast forward this slide in the interest and come back to something. One of the things that we often talk about in economics is sort of the, bang for your buck kind of idea. And one of the things that we think about in terms of the effectiveness of this fiscal response is how much of that extra stimulus money, the $600 unemployment benefit, some of the stimulus money that we got from the IRS following this, and also from PPP. A survey suggests that it's only about 0.25 to 0.35 per dollar of stimulus during the first few days of the pandemic effect, right? So really the point out here is it matters who gets it, and 65% to 75% of the people who are getting the stimulus check are not spending it right away. So in terms of the effectiveness, what I would say as far as policy is concerned, we know what to do from a policy standpoint, right? We can increase government spending, we can reduce taxes on a fiscal response, but if you and I are not spending that money, it's not going to get the wheels of the economy churning. And this to me remains a concern. One of the bright spots as far as policy is concerned has been monetary policy, correct? I think the Fed was very quick to act, far quicker than Congress was, right? On March 3rd, it had an unscheduled meeting and it dropped its federal funds rate by 50 basis points. And then on March 15th, another unscheduled meeting from the FOMC, and they dropped it another full 1% or 100 basis points. So today our federal funds rate is between the range 0 and 0.25%. When you're zero, they've done a whole bunch of unconventional things that you can see. I'll let you read them. And these were sort of measures that we took during the Great Recession to try to loosen credit in the economy. But again, I know there's the old adage, right? You can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. And really, it's not clear how effective these have been in terms of these additional liquidity measures that the Fed has taken, right? I think time will tell. But I would say that that was a bright spot, right, from the Federal Reserve. So these are some growth projections that the IMF has made, right? It thinks that the United States will, have negative growth at -8%, but it's sort of painting a slightly rosier picture of 4.8% in 2021. I'm not sure about that. I think I've shared with you, I think that we'll start the year off and we'll still continue to have, in my opinion, maybe negative growth rates in 2021. So I'm going to stop sharing here, but I'm going to utilize my time. It looks like I've got maybe a couple of 5 or 6 minutes more before I hand off to my other co-speaker, Quentin, in just a second. But I'll just make some quick comments and then leave some space in the end to ask some questions. So I think it's fair to say that none of us could have imagined that this adverse supply shock of a magnitude, of such a magnitude, correct? I think that Congress is in the midst of another discussion of another rescue bill, but it's been caught up in, as some of you have read, in some massive partisan politics between the House and Congress. One of the pinch points in the economy coming up is something that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell sort of shared with various audiences, including in Congress. He is pretty emphatic that federal aid to state and local governments deserves serious consideration. He notes that 13% of the American workforce is employed by state and local governments. Some of them were initially laid off. If those layoffs continue, it is massively going to hamper our recovery effort in the United States. So my sense is with fourth of our current population not working or re-employed at considerably lower wages, and with fewer prospects for gainful employment in the next year or so, a significant percentage of our tax revenue in the United States, about 3.5 trillion annually, will nosedive through 2020 and 2021, right? I'll make reference to the federal debt. I think the fact of the matter is the federal debt will increase given the stimulus packages that we've got in place already without us doing anything about it, right? And state and local governments will take a big hit as their retail and sales taxes fall. So as we approach, I think 2021, there's a couple of important questions. If the government, once the government is able and we're able to get the economy, open and up to sort of reasonable normal again, in my mind, there's two possibilities. The first possibility is that we will need no further stimulus, in the remaining time that we have this year and in 21. And that's an optimistic view, right? It assumes that reopening the economy will allow businesses to very quickly rehire workers, resume pre-pandemic operations, and economic growth will be strong. Another economy suggests that the economy will remain stagnant and this disease will hang over us for a longer time than we'd imagine, right? And despite the government's efforts, business might not be able to reopen, consumers will shift their demand and reduce consumption, and this might, in that scenario, I think, call for a more traditional government stimulus, perhaps even in 21, okay? All of this has undoubtedly, and I can anticipate this as a question, has ballooned our budget deficit. The CBO expects our federal debt held by the public to equal 100% of our GDP. So our debt to GDP ratio will be at about 100%. It's never really been that high. Keep in mind that when I say our debt to GDP is 100%, we're a $20 trillion economy. So this inevitably raises the question, whether the US government can continue to borrow at such a pace. To me, the answer is that it can, right? And, the only way in which that stops is if investors lose confidence in the US economy. At this point, however, investors have not lost confidence in the US economy as it relates to US debt, all right? 70 to 80% of the total US debt is held by commercial banks, the US public, and the US Federal Reserve Bank, right? 20% is on the outside. But when the US government says, I promise to pay, that perhaps suggests that the world is interested in our debt, more of it, not less, okay? Now, something else I want to return to, because I said that state and local governments are an important piece of our puzzle up here, right? We can think of two examples. One example I want to think a little bit about is New York City, right? The New York City MTA projects that projects about revenue loss of about $3.7 billion if ridership trends don't improve, right? For those of you who've traveled to New York City and are in fact from that city, ridership on the subway has fallen by 60 to 80%, right? Mark Zandi, who's an economist at Moody's Analytics, says we really run the risk of running into a vicious cycle where people's wages are down, states are raising taxes to make up for the shortfall. And he reminds us that state and local governments administer some of America's most important programs: education, public safety, healthcare, employment insurance, and the likes. And so he too feels like the federal government needs to step in with a stimulus package that is aimed directly at helping state and local economies. And the reason is simple. State and local state governments are bound by a balanced budget requirement. The Federal Reserve has no such requirement in terms of a balanced budget. As I finish up, I want to sort of make reference to an economist whose name is Glenn Hubbard. I'm teaching a class right now, which is a money and banking course. Glenn Hubbard is a professor at Columbia, and he was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George Bush. He too, in various interviews, has implored Congress to try to sort of help state governments and also local governments, right? And he says that, look, Congress can do something very simple. It can probably just have a rule that says that the stimulus money that goes to state should not be used to reduce taxes or to bail out pensions. And I'll finish with a quote, which I thought was pretty, pretty striking. He says, listen, if an overweight person comes to the ER with a heart attack, you treat the heart attack before you lecture him or her about his weight. And I think that's kind of where I would lie, anticipating that you might have questions and I might get some pushback on that. But that's the sense in which I think the United States is a country that can well afford further stimulus packages, especially aimed at helping states, or infrastructure packages to get our infrastructure sort of rolling and going again. And the cost of not doing something, I think, is really much more dire than just saying the market economy will fix this up. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've just about used up my 20 minutes, and I'm going to punt this to my fellow economics major and student, Quentin White.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khandke. So let me go ahead and share my screen and welcome everyone to joining us today. All right, just to introduce myself a little bit, my name is Quentin White. I'm a 2008 graduate of Furman University. After Furman, I spent a little bit of time with the Miami Dolphins and then the US Census Bureau. And then I decided to go back to graduate school to get a PhD in economics. I graduated recently from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I'm now working at the Treasury Department in the Office of Tax Analysis. So that's my background, and along those lines, I do need to say that anything I say today, anything I express is any opinions are entirely my own. Nothing I say today represents the U.S. Treasury Department in any way, and per Treasury Department policy, I can't answer or comment on any policy question. So if you have a policy question, feel free to ask it. I'm just going to direct that towards Dr. Khandke or Dr. Peterson if he wants to hop in. Anyway, so what I want to do in my portion of today's talk, which should take about 15 minutes, one, I'll kind of echo some of the comments of Dr. Khandke on the state of the economy. We'll look at GDP and employment, as well as consumer spending. What are consumers doing today? And I'm going to focus in a little bit on South Carolina, just because even if we're coming from all over the world today, we all probably have some special place in our heart for South Carolina. Then I want to look at some various industries, which you can think of in some ways as kind of indicators for how the economy is doing. And all of this is coming from a couple of sources that are publicly available and that I would encourage you to follow up on. And I purposely chose things that are very easily accessible to the public. One is a blog called Calculated Risk. He's pulling mostly public data, and he's just putting it the same data over and over again into graphs that you can follow and you can track. He's a former financial analyst named Bill McBride. He's been doing it for a long time. The other is a website, tracktherecovery.org. This is a group of economists from Harvard and Brown. Raj Chetty is kind of the lead on it. And what they've done is they've partnered with private organizations. A lot of the data I'm going to show you today is coming from credit and debit cards. And so while it's not a substitute for good government statistics, which you should also look at, or you might see more reporting on, it is a nice complement. It can also give us some real-time data and also allows us to zoom in on something like South Carolina. So the big question is, how bad has 2020 been? And my very sophisticated answer is really, really bad. But we might want to be a little bit more specific and dive in a little bit more deeply. So on the first figure I have here, I'm basically going to be showing you a bunch of figures, a bunch of graphs, and along the x-axis on all my graphs will be some kind of measure of time. Here we're looking at since World War II and recession since World War II, and GDP. And the red line is tracking GDP. And its percentage of its prior peak. So when it's at the top, we're at peak GDP. And then when you see real GDP decline, then it's going to drop from the top 100% line. In blue, you have recessions as called by the NBER, a group of economists. And what immediately jumps out is this stark decline recently of about 10% of GDP. which we think of the 2008-2009 recession as quite a bad recession, but that was only a 4% decline. And so, the big takeaway here is in terms of GDP, it's fallen faster, further than in prior recessions. But, and this already came up, I saw one of the questions that came up during Dr. Khandke's talk is, GDP is this number that economists have made up, but, we also might want to think about, what about employment? What about people's jobs? And not to say this captures everything, but again, even in these kind of raw numbers, employment fell incredibly hard and very quickly relative to prior recessions where, again, in 2008, 2009, a pretty bad recession, employment fell by, 6% or so. Here we've seen a very steep decline to, about 86% of prior employment. And, one way to think about, how should we think about this recession and think about recessions in the recent times is how long is it going to take us to recovery? So what this is showing you is each line on this graph is one of the post-World War II recessions. So this doesn't include the Great Depression, which Dr. Khandke talked about. But it's how long till we get back to prior employment levels. So you have the 2007 recession, you can tell it took a very long, in blue, took a very long time for us to recover, about 72 months, about 6 years. Right before that, the 2001 recession also took a long time relative to historical recessions and, took 3.5, 4 years to recover from. And you can see this 2020 recession where we had this very steep decline. We've had some recovery, but even then we're well below the depths of prior recessions. And it's an open question, how long is it going to take us to recover and get back to peak employment? The other thing I think we can think about, we can start looking at is consumer spending. And this is coming from that credit and debit card data I mentioned earlier. And on the one hand, consumer spending relative to this is looking at just 2020, and it's comparing to the January levels. We've mostly actually recovered in terms of consumer spending, at least among credit and debit card users who might be a little bit more wealthy than the population as a whole. And South Carolina's done a little bit better, but it's also important to keep in mind here, right, that comparisons to a January level might understate the decline because people, in the summer generally are spending more and doing more. The other important thing to think, while spending has overall recovered by quite a bit, it's actually masking a lot of changes underneath. So we can look at something like groceries, which relative to January are up slightly, both in South Carolina and the US as a whole. You see this kind of very notable spike in March when we all rushed out to buy everything up in the grocery store. At least my family certainly did. But this spending rate is in some ways substituting from other things. So we can look at something like restaurants. We saw this really deep decline relative to January levels of up to 60, 70%. And we've seen kind of a steady recovery, but we're actually still down quite a bit. And again, down maybe more than we would be in a typical summer. And these are actually, I think what's hard to imagine is, restaurants are an industry where there's a lot of ability for them to adapt. Other things we're not seeing necessarily the same level of recovery. So look at something like entertainment and a steep decline that down to, again, 70+%, and some recovery, but still less than about half of the level we were in January. And we might even think that, again, during the summers and during the warmer months, we might be spending more on entertainment, going to more concerts, that sort of thing. We could also look at something like transportation spending. And again, relative to January levels, we've had a similar pattern here. We're at a really steep decline in the March months, some recovery over the beginning of April, May, and June. But again, it kind of stalled out at about 45% decline. We might again think this might be steeper than the prior months. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I wanted to look at some different industry indicators you can think of as capturing, where are we, how has the past year progressed, and also, to what extent are people recovering and getting back to normal. So first up, and this kind of relates to the last graph I was showing you on consumer spending, is we can look at airline travel. And what we have here is data from the TSA, and comparing in blue is the 2019 number of passengers, and in red in 2020 is the 2020 number of passengers, and the gray dotted line you see there is the percentage of passengers last year. And so, you see this again, this steep decline is a 7-day average, so it's not exactly a particular week, but the steep decline at the beginning of the year. And while there's been some recovery, it's largely stalled out over the last few months. And we're only at about 30% of airline travel relative. And of course, you can connect this to kind of people's public health concerns about traveling on airlines. We can think about other things. So something like gasoline, or maybe people are moving around more. Gasoline is a general indicator for kind of economic activity. This red line is comparing to the percentage of gasoline consumption for the same week in 2019. And we're down slightly. You can think about this also as kind of substitution from some of that air travel, potentially, but still down 10% or so as an indicator of kind of a decline in economic activity and a stalling out over the last few months. Data here is looking at, this is coming from cell phone data and people moving around. And each of the lines here is either one of a major city in the US, either New York, LA, Chicago, or Houston, or the US is in black, the US for national. And this is comparing again to January levels. And so you had this steep decline in economic activity in March, followed by a partial recovery, but largely people have kind of slowed down and we kind of stalled out a little bit in terms of a recovery the last few months. And we're at about half of January level, and that again might be understating it somewhat. So hotels, another industry that we might think of as being especially hard hit by the pandemic, but also we could track to see, are people recovering? Are they getting back to normal? In the solid blue line is the median level of hotel occupancy for a given week of the year for 2000 to 2018. The dashed blue line there is the 2019 level, and you can see that 2020 was kind of proceeding as normal, and then the steep decline here in the black line you have there is kind of a prior recession, which you might think of as like, okay, we had a really bad recession. How much does this hotel occupancy normally drop off? We saw this much more substantial decline down to kind of levels in the 20-25% range. And while there's been again this kind of recovery, you can still see hotel occupancy is way down, right? About 50% of 50% occupancy, and substantially down from where we were in 2019 or where we are normally. And finally, just to kind of show you kind of worst case scenario in some ways for industries across the US, this is looking at movie sales. So this is looking at box office sales. As most of the theaters in the country close, you can see in red, you have the 2020 box office sales went all the way down to zero. The dashed lines are the max and the min for kind of recent years, for 2016 to 2019. And while there's been a little bit of an uptick recently, as maybe like drive-in theaters have opened and a few theaters and some states have opened back up, I think that little spike recently might be that movie Tenet, not really positive. But this is kind of worst case scenario, and also hard to imagine, like what are these firms going to be doing going forward, and how many of them will be opening back up, and what will kind of movies look like going forward. So these are just kind of industries I wanted to highlight to kind of think about, like where we are and at what point are we kind of in the recovery process. So just to kind of broad things I'd hope you'd take away from this. One, just that, truly historic decline in GDP and employment in terms of the rate at which it declined and the rate where it declined to. And despite some recovery, economic activity is substantially less than in prior recessions. And we don't know kind of how long it'll take us to fully recover. And some of that recovery varies across industries or spending areas. And I think you can kind of directly and intuitively connect that to kind of public health concerns. And again, I'd encourage you, these are sources which are public and easy to access. And they kind of repeat over and over again. So you can kind of check in on them every couple of weeks or every month, and just see how we're doing. And it's a good way, I think, to get away from some of the kind of news cycle of describing the economy, and kind of get what are people actually doing, and what does behavior look like. So thank you very much. I'm sure we have some questions, and I'll be hanging around to answer questions along with Dr. Khandke. All right.
Jane, how do you want to handle questions? Should we just, you want me to feed them to the two experts here? Would that be okay?
If you'd like to, and I know Quentin has been looking at some of those.
Okay.
I know we've got a few that are out there, yes.
Okay, Kailash, you had indicated that you would answer one live, I believe. You want to take Denai's question?
On unemployment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I think that we know about unemployment, I think, is this, right? The unemployment rate that we get comes from a monthly household survey of 60,000 people. Some of the information that the Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers is based on unemployment insurance, but it's not based solely on claims, right? Rather, unemployment and whether you're employed or unemployment is based on some very simple questions. So this was one of the things that I was talking about earlier, which is that, as far as if you're working even in effect 1 hour a week, you are considered unemployed. And that's what's happening with our restaurants and, in our service industry, correct? So there's two things that are going on at the unemployment level in terms of the 8.4% that it's not fully capturing, right? There's two additional categories that the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates. One is what we call, discouraged worker effect. So these are people who have been maybe filing for unemployment insurance and sort of signaling in the survey that they're looking for work, but they've simply stopped working, that they have become frustrated with the current pandemic, have sent out applications, are simply not finding jobs. These are people who don't even count in our labor force. And there's a significant number of people who are discouraged right now. The Bureau of Labor Statistics also sort of calculates what's called the marginal unemployment effect. So this would be the kind of, sort of, right? These are the people who are kind of looking for work, sort of looking for work, but not doing so in a sort of a really sort of emphatic, explicit sort of way. So there's three categories of things that we might think of as far as unemployment is concerned, right? There's the unemployment where people who are literally looking for work and haven't found work. There's the discouraged worker effect, and there's the marginal worker effect, right? And unemployment insurance plays a part in that, but that's not explicitly what the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses in calculating its unemployment rate. So I trust that was a little helpful.
Thanks, Kailash. This next one looks like it might be for Quentin. So can you talk more about the different possible shapes of recovery? So the alphabet is very popular in the media. So are we going to have a V, a K, a W, a U, an L? What are we looking at in terms of recovery in your view?
Yeah, I mean, so when people are talking about that, and you could, I think there was the one graph I showed with the different recessions and kind of the shape of those different recessions. And the V recovery is this idea that we would have a steep decline, and then the recovery portion of the, once we hit our trough, or once we hit the bottom point of that graph, then the recovery would look similar to that. That, it goes down and goes back up. The idea behind a K recovery is that the recovery will look very different for different types of people. So you have this steep decline and then kind of a divergence where some people are going to recover maybe very quickly and get back to their lives, and other people are going to have this long, drawn out recovery. I don't have any special insight on kind of what the recovery is going to look like. That's going to depend oftentimes on kind of the policy route that we take, and the support that we give to people. And I think it's a kind of an open question. That's kind of the two different descriptions. I think everyone is hoping for some kind of V-shaped recovery where things kind of progress at a rapid rate back. And I think ultimately that'll depend on, in some ways that's a public health concern, right? So as people feel better and more comfortable, returning to restaurants, flying, doing all these different things, that's some of the ones that I highlighted, then they'll get back to those things, and that'll help spur the recovery.
Thanks, Quentin. That's great. Nino's got a question for Dr. Khandke. This one pertains to the Fed response. Here, I'll read it so that other people can hear it as well. So he says, Dr. Khandke, in your presentation, you mentioned some of the monetary policy responses from the Fed. I was wondering, what is your opinion regarding the Fed's new strategy announcement in August about average inflation targeting, and the Fed saying that they will be more inclined to allow inflation to run higher than the standard 2% inflation target for some time?
Thanks for the question. You know, I knew I'd get the tough one from you. Listen, so I think that here's the thing, right? I think that we've seen two things as far as the Fed is concerned, right? If you go and look at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors page, it says, listen, our goals are, you know, price stability, you know, low levels of unemployment and steady growth. But implicitly, we know that the Fed, to your question, has really been much more concerned about inflation targeting through the Taylor rule and otherwise, right? And, you know, they've looked at that and sort of felt like, you know, inflation has really trended below 2% for the longest of times, right? I think their analysis is that there's not going to be any kind of real massive supply crunch in the economy, you know, towards the end of this year in 2021, so that they feel that inflation is going to be under control, right? And if it's going to be under control, really, they feel like we can focus on some of these other objectives that we've sort of implicitly had in the background besides inflation targeting, you know, thinking a little bit about unemployment, thinking a little bit about growth and stability. So I feel like, you know, their forecast is that we're not going to see inflation. And their forecast, therefore, is that we're not going to see too much sort of, you know, economic growth over the long term. And that is why, in some ways, they've signaled that they're going to leave the short-term interest rate, the federal funds rate, just where it is, you know, right at 0% and 0.25%. One of the ways I would answer your question, I think, is this is something I think the Fed ought to do in terms of a change of policy, right? Sometimes they've been secretive. We really don't know what the FOMC is up to. I think what's going to be crucial, if there's something different that they can do, is to be much more transparent moving forward and announce exactly what they're going to do. So, you know, almost every 3 months, 6 months, say, look, we're not going to be changing interest rates, right? We're not going to go to, I think implicit in your question is negative interest rates that we've gone in Europe, right? I think that would be tremendously helpful as far as that's concerned. So I think that in some ways, your question is saying, you know, is the Fed signaling the right sorts of things? And I think this is exactly what we're going to see. I think we're going to see much more transparency and signaling, because I think that's going to mitigate any uncertainty we might have in the economy.
Thanks, Kailash. I just want to make two comments about about Ken Shigley's earlier question that I answered roughly and perhaps badly by text. I think one of the great questions that no one knows the answer to is how tastes and preferences are going to be permanently altered by the pandemic. So if you think about it, you know, when in recent history have so many people so dramatically altered their habits, how they spend their money, how they spend their time. This is going to affect, I think, major trends as it relates to various industries. And the people who are able to think through that and outguess the American people, but also people around the world, will get rich very quickly, I think. What that looks like, on the other hand, is not so clear to everybody. So if you think about the real estate question, we know for a fact that people are working from home. The question we have for the future is how many of those people will continue to work from home? And therefore, how many people are going to be looking for slightly larger houses or better quality spaces so that it can be their office as well as their home? And we're not sure about that. We know that some businesses have already made pronouncements that they are going to remain remote for the foreseeable future. So some people are going to continue to work from home. We know that in the creative sector, however, there are serious concerns about whether or not productivity can be maintained if your industry requires a lot of creative activity and innovation, because it's not clear that Zoom is a good substitute for that spontaneous face-to-face interaction that drives a lot of innovation. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation, because I think those long-term micro behavioral trends are something that we're going to want to keep our eye on really closely.
Yeah, I'll just add one kind of other element that people just might want to think about, or kind of is an open question going forward, is how's that going to affect something like urbanization? And is this going to spur people to move into cities, move out of cities? And you can actually kind of come up with arguments on both ways. And so all of that's going to have, I think, potentially dramatic impacts on something like home prices, but it's all very uncertain.
And density has been an engine of economic growth over the last century. So what we have now are forces that are really anti-density. They're causing us to want to spread out. And so what will happen in the macro economy if that's scaled across the entire country for an extended period of time? If we lose the productivity gains that we made by people and businesses clustering close together, what does that look like in the future? And will technology provide enough of a substitute so that we can maintain that productivity enhancement no matter where we're located? That is a huge question that I think we don't know the answer to.
And if I can,
that's a great point.
Jump into something that both Quentin and Dr. Peterson said. And that is that, look, if we think back to sort of what's happening with state governments, right? There's a massive fall in revenue because, let's say in South Carolina, right? There's millions of dollars that they're losing from the gas tax, of the 2-cent gas tax that sort of, they proposed some years ago, right? Car ridership and gasoline use is just not as high. And so as states grapple with these kinds of things, I was just talking to my cousin in New Jersey. He says, look, gas taxes have become the highest ever in our history and the highest in the country, correct? And this is at a time when I've sort of argued that real wages are going down. Well, if states are going to sort of try to fix their revenue, there's only a couple of ways they can do this. They're already hit on the expenditure side in terms of services provided. And so what has New Jersey done? It's raised taxes, right? It's raised property taxes, it's raised gas taxes and stuff like that. And to Quentin's point, again, anecdotally, my cousin tells me a whole bunch of his neighbors are leaving for where? For Florida and Texas, correct? I think to escape some of those property taxes. Whether this continues in that fashion and we continue to see this play out over a longer period of time is going to say something about sort of these urbanization patterns, I think. You're already seeing flight out of New York City. Are you actually going to see flight out of big states? And how massive is that effect going to be in terms of the high tax states, right? And that, I think, is really going to say something about the patterns of urbanization, that Dr. Peterson has taught about and knows well about. So I think it's really fascinating, but in a sad sort of way to see what's going to happen, I think.
In a sad sort of way, that's right. Well, Quentin and Kailash, thank you so much for making time to come and speak today. And I want to give a shout out to all of our great Furman alumni out there that we can't see. As you could probably tell, Quentin and Kailash and I had a blast. We hope this wasn't too bad for you as well. And we want to thank you for your continued support of Furman and your encouragement in these difficult times. And we wish you the very, very best and all of the health in the world as this pandemic progresses. So be well. Thank you. Over to you, Jane.
Great. Thank you. I mean, I can't say anything more than that, Dr. Peterson. Thank you so much to everybody that's here. Thank you to the presenters. I really do appreciate all your time and energy and effort put towards this. Certainly hope that it was informative. I certainly got a lot out of it. I hope everybody else did. And I'm so excited about this business series. Just to let you know that we've got 2 more coming up. On October 22nd, we have a nonpartisan view, what the 2020 election, what will matter in that election. That's at noon on October 22nd. And then 7 p.m. on December 3rd, The Kids Aren't All Right, Growing Up in a Pandemic and What Comes Next. So certainly look for those to be sent out and the details of that for our next business series. But again, thank everybody for being here. Thank you so much for all your knowledge and wisdom that you shared with everybody today. And as always, go Dens. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ken, are you still there?
Yep.
Hanging in there?
Hanging in there.
I'm assuming
It was a
nobody-
blast, Kailash. This was fun. We had to do this more often.
Yeah. I'm assuming nobody's listening in, right? On a
Yeah,
webinar.
no, they could well be.
Are you still doing okay?
This could be a hot mic situation, Kailash. You know those are dangerous. Yeah, we're doing well. I hope you are as well.
Yeah, hanging in there. This is
good.
difficult.
They're tough times, man. They're tough times.
Tough times, difficult. I think in terms of everything, and I just saw this report which comes into me on schools that are doing a great job with their testing protocol and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know. I think we're not on that top 10 list, but I tell you what, I think